Jesus is Lord and he's coming back. I'm back to talk about biblical slavery, quote unquote biblical slavery. Um, was in fact a choice. It was a voluntary system of work that was part of the ancient Near Eastern, as far as the Israelites were concerned, the Hebrews, part of their economic system. So it was a system in which poor people, migrants, could come to the land of Israel and find work and find meaningful or gainful employment. And they called these individuals Yvets, the word that has been translated into slave. So, unlike Mr. Kanye's assertion that the antebellum slavery was a choice, which um, I don't know even know if he was referring to the antebellum South or not, but um, biblical slavery was certainly a choice. Okay, that's the first thing. That's the distinction that Matt Dillahunty, that liberal scholars try to blur. They want to blur that distinction between a voluntary act or a voluntary servant and an involuntary servant, so that you would think in your mind that this was all involuntary, or anytime you hear the word slave, it must mean involuntary servitude. That wasn't the case then, and it's really not the case today, but not so much the case today. But that was the case back then, that the word slave could be used to denote both involuntary and voluntary servitude. Okay. So the job of the skeptic, if he or she is honest, would be to search the context to determine if the eved, since they use the word to describe both voluntary and involuntary, if that eved that is being spoken of, is he there against his will, or did someone force him to be there? That would be the job of the skeptic. That would be the job of the reader. It's not God's job to show you how to read context. God expects us to learn how to read, or at least to read the Bible as we would read any other literature or any other historical book or text. My biblical slavery challenge is still on the table. There are no takers. Many have tried and have failed. But it is a challenge to the skeptic to meet. If they want to prove that the Bible condones slavery, you have to prove the Bible condones slavery as we define the word today, not as they define the word then. So simply looking, because remember, they define the word, or they use the word to denote both voluntary and involuntary servants. So someone who volunteered to work would have still been called an aved or a slave. So your job would be, the challenge for the skeptic would be to prove involuntary servitude of a person. That's what Matt Dillahunty hasn't done. That's what Dr. Josh hasn't done. They can't. That's why they'll never debate anyone on this subject that actually understands this. They'll find people who, or allow people to call in on their show who don't understand this. And I'm going to show you a clip from Mr. Dillahunty's Atheist Experience show where that is on full display. They do not want to debate someone like myself or G-Man, Smokey the Saint, Feckle, who actually knows what the praise that I am, for example, who was my partner in a debate or modern day debate against Dr. Josh. They don't want to debate us because we know how to answer this question. The old tired Matt Dillahunty canard. When is it okay to own another person? Right. So the challenge for the skeptic would be to prove involuntary servitude, not just prove that the word slave is in the Bible. That's not enough because the word slave meant something different to them. It meant more than just someone who's being forced. It meant more than someone who's being forced to be someone else's property. Your job, skeptic, is to prove the involuntary servitude, not the extent of the servitude, and how many years the slave had to serve. That's not what we're asking for. In order to prove there is slavery in the Bible, you must prove that the slave is there against his will. There's a caveat. You must prove that in scenarios in which we would not confine today in our culture or enforce servitude onto another involuntarily. So you can't point to cases in war in the Bible where they are capturing captees or captives. You can't point to a case in which someone has committed a crime and they're involuntarily forced to work. Because you would be a hypocrite because in our country, in our culture, we do the same to criminals and we do the same to POWs. So here's my biblical slavery challenge. That's your challenge, but here is it. It's sort of in a syllogism type of form, if you will. The Hebrews use slavery, as I explained, to denote both voluntary and involuntary servants. That's a fact. That's a fact that no scholar, whether it be conservative or liberal, will deny. They use the same word to denote a slave that is forced to be there against his will. You were called the same as someone who wanted to be there, who volunteered to their service. You were both called a slave or an vet. The number two, the only scenarios in which involuntary service would be sanctioned are in scenarios in which we would sanction involuntary servanthood today. If you owe the IRS, you will be served involuntarily. If you're a conservative, they'll come and serve you with uh, a task force and SWAT teams. Okay, you will be served, and you'll be put in prison against your will. All right, or someone who is captured during wartime, they are put in prison. They are, in sometimes even made to work. According to the Geneva Convention, they can be forced to work against their will. Criminals are being put in jail. You can't go to the Bible and find cases in which criminals or POWs are put in jail, or in their case, because they didn't have a jail system like we have today, you would be put in the workforce, or you would be an vet. You would be forced to work to pay restitution for the crime you committed. Okay, so you can't go to those scenarios in the Bible and point to those scenarios and say, aha, we got you now. No, because those scenarios are still the case today in America, in American culture. All right. That's the only time in which, quote unquote, slavery is sanctioned in the Bible. Debt, POWs, there are a couple of other circumstances in which you would be forced to work. Instead of throwing you in jail for 40 years, you worked to pay restitution, according to Exodus 21, I believe. Therefore, biblical slavery, when we define the word slavery as we would today, does not exist. It just simply doesn't exist. I've already debated your best scholars on this. They lost. It doesn't exist. All right, so this is I found this clip on Matt Dillahunty's channel. I guess he was trying to respond to G-Man, but he won't debate G-Man, but he'll respond to Gmail on his in his safe space on his channel, but he won't debate G-Man. Again, he won't debate anyone on this subject that actually knows what the heck they're talking about. And in this clip, he had a conversation with an atheist, or with a Christian. And this is what I entitled this clip: How Not to Answer the Question of Slavery in the Bible. How not to answer the question of slavery.
So we've got Greg in Florida who wants to find out why slavery is immoral, which is perhaps one of the weirdest things I've ever heard. Greg,
Man,
how
this
are
was
you?
bad. How not to
Doing
answer the
well. Thank
question
you,
of
man. I
slavery.
appreciate that.
Do you think I should be allowed by law to own you as property?
If it's okay with you, Matt, I'd prefer not having a conversation as to what you and I personally believe, but rather more in terms of having a logical conversation about what.
I'm sorry that you think a conversation about what we believe is in any way not logical, but it will only be not logical on your end. I asked a question. Do you feel that it should be legally permissible for me to own you as a slave, as property?
That it seems like a really simple question to answer, but
it is a really simple question to answer. The answer is no. Well, if your answer is yes, then come on over. I got lots of shit in the garage that needs doing.
Matt, may I approach it from a different direction?
Are you going to answer my question?
Well, personally, I don't want to be anybody's slave.
Okay. See, instead of looking for traps, as I've had this conversation many, 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 many more times than you have, maybe trust that I know what I'm asking. So if you don't want to be my slave and I don't want to be your slave, why isn't that enough?
So I would like to take it kind of away from humans for just a moment, because
I'm not, because slavery is all about fucking humans. Why would you want to take it away from humans? Right? Do you have some plan that precludes you from actually discussing the thing that you wanted to discuss?
Well, no.
Stick with humans.
This is actually, my question isn't about just only humans, though, and that's what I'd like your help with.
But that's what slavery is. You called in to ask why slavery is immoral. Slavery only applies to other humans. If you're here to make a subtle animal rights point, just don't.
It's not for animal rights. It's more for why does it make sense? Like, is it okay if I ask you a question? It seems like you're not super.
I guess it's just frustrating to me that you will not answer mine. So when I don't answer yours, are you going to have any cause to be able to complain?
All right. That was just horrible. I don't know who this guy is, but he needs to take a course on hermeneutics, or what's called apologetics, and how to defend the faith. That's not an answer. I'm gonna play this back again, and I'm gonna show you how you answer Matt Dillahunty. If you happen to call in to his show and he lets you in, if you are a G-man or myself, you might have to lie about your identity to get on his show, because he simply doesn't want any interaction with Christians that are equipped to answer this question. His famous canard: when is it okay to own another person? So we're gonna take a look at this.
Perhaps one of the weirdest things I've ever heard. Greg, how are you?
Okay, why is that weird to him? Because he believes he's forcing an enslavement scenario onto the text without proving an enslavement. He's forcing enslavement onto the text, or into the text, without proving enslavement. That's called eisegesis, not exegesis.
Well, thank you, man. I appreciate that.
Do you think I should be allowed by law to own you as property?
You already, by law, can own someone as property if they consent to that ownership of them as your property. If I go up to Matt Dillahunty and say, Matt Dillahunty, I want you to be my property, and the extent of that, who knows, doesn't matter, because it's a decision between me and the person. Now, whether or not legally, he could go to the court and say, you know what, Jill was my property last weekend and he didn't keep his obligation. I'm suing him for what he promised to do. No, that wouldn't be binding in the court. That's besides the point. The point is that I feel that he's my property. That's the relationship, the contractual relationship that we both made. He feels that I want to be his property. We make that decision, we make that determination on the extent of the ownership, whatever that might be. It's still my voluntary choice to be his property. So, no, it is not illegal to be someone's property in the United States if they choose. What's illegal, again, what did I say earlier in the stream? The atheist, the liberal scholar, because they don't have an argument for biblical slavery, will try to blur the distinction between a voluntary and an involuntary act. It's a classic pull the wool over the eyes, sleight of mind trick. Okay. They're expecting you to go into the conversation already considering that in you, when you hear the word slave, it must be someone who is forced. I'm going to show you why that is wrong thinking. Okay. Because the Hebrews didn't think of a slave as someone who was forced. They thought of a slave that someone who could be someone who also not just forced, but someone who wanted to work. So they thought of a way, they thought of a slave in two different ways. We only think of a slave today in one way, someone who's forced. So that's the sleight of mind trick Dr. Josh plays in Matt Dillahunty and the rest of the liberal scumbags on the internet. That's the mind trick that they play with their hearers because they're not expecting you to know that the ancient Near East thought differently about that word slave than we do today. So yes, it is legal today in America. So yes, I wouldn't have a problem with being someone's slave. It's not illegal. You wouldn't be able to come to my house and arrest me or Matt for that transaction.
Um, if it's okay with you, Matt, I'd prefer not having a conversation as to what you and I personally
He doesn't know how to
believe, but
answer. That's why he
rather
doesn't want to. He
more
wants to
in
change
terms
the
of having
subject.
a logical conversation about
Terrible.
what.
I'm sorry that you think a conversation about what we believe is in any way not logical, but it will only be not logical on your end. I asked a question. Do you feel that it should be legally permissible for me to own you as a slave?
It already is legally permissible. You couldn't find one law, Matt, that would suggest otherwise. It's already legally permissible, not legally binding. Those are two different things. Legally permissible, yes, but not legally binding, meaning if someone agrees to be your property and they don't show up for work, you couldn't sue that person and say they agreed to be my property and they agreed to work for a week to pay back the debt that they owed me. That contract wouldn't be binding, but it is not illegal. Okay, so atheists will try to conflate binding and legalism. Something being legally binding is not necessarily, or something that is legal and you're allowed to do it, you're allowed to make that agreement with someone, is not to be conflated with something that is legally binding. Now that you've made the agreement, they can now go to the court and sue you if you don't follow through. Okay, I hope we're following here. This isn't rocket science. It really isn't. This is really easy to deal with this. And again, the reason why Matt Dillahunty has blocked me from his show is because he doesn't want to talk to Christians that can do what I'm doing right now.
As property?
That it seems like a really simple question to answer, but
It is a really simple question to answer. The answer is no. If your answer is yes, then come on over. I got lots of shit in the garage that needs doing.
Sure, I'll come over, Matt. It is perfectly legal to do so. I don't know what this idiot is laughing about. DB Ramsey. He looks like he might be the descendant of a slave master or a slave owner. Yeah, Matt, I'll come over, but I'm doing so voluntarily. See that? I'm doing so voluntarily. I am coming over. They shall come from other nations, right? That's what Leviticus 25 says. Nowhere in the text does it say you may go there and take them from those other nations against their will. You see, he's not even realizing that he's proving his argument to be false on its face without even realizing. Yes, when you, Matt Dillahunty, if I come over to your home to be your property, I'm coming over to your home by my own volition, Matt, not because you forced me to be your property. He just destroyed his own argument. But the caller, again, is not aware of how to deal with this canard, and that's why he struggles.
Matt, may I approach it from a different direction?
Are you going to answer my question?
Well, personally, I don't want to be anybody's slave.
Okay. See, instead of looking for traps, as I've had this conversation many more times than you have, maybe trust that I know what I'm
Not with
asking. So
me, you won't.
if you
Not
don't
with
want to be my
G-Man, you won't.
slave and I don't want to be your slave, why isn't that enough?
So I would like to take it kind of away from humans for just a moment because
I'm not, because slavery is all about fucking humans.
All right, so there's no reason to take it to away from humans. Now, I've seen this argument that G-Man gives, which is slightly different. And G-Man's argument about animals is slightly different than what this man was saying. In fact, G-Man's argument is solid, where he plays on the atheist um, understanding of human nature, which they say is we're just animals. So he plays on their hypocrisy and demonstrates that we're not just animals, because if we were just animals, you wouldn't have a problem with slavery. So that's a different argument than what this man was presenting, which he didn't. You don't have to go there, period, in the first place. Okay, how do we answer the question of slavery? How do we answer when is it ever okay to own another person? When that person wants to be owned, it's okay to own another person. When is it ever okay to own another person? When that person wants to be owned. Not rocket science. Very non or very commonsensical answer to Matt Dillahunty's tired old canard that he's still pushing, I'm seeing on his channel. There's a reason why you blocked me from coming onto your show, Matt Dungahunty. Congratulations, you won the Dung Cupcake Award for that canard. That tired canard. It's been debunked ad nauseum, ad infinitum. Again, when is it ever okay? Very simple. Call into the show. I'm not allowed to call in, so you call in and have him ask you this question and just simply say, when that person wants to be owned, it is okay according to American jurisprudence, according to the law. And again, whether something is legally binding, service, I know you tried to use that argument, and that's why I'm going to keep debunking it. Whether it's legally binding, whether you can go now and say that this person promised that I would own them and they would work and they didn't do it, the judge is going to say, nope, you can't own someone as property. You can make that agreement. It's not illegal to make that agreement with two people, or two people can make that agreement, but you can't go to the judge and try to make it binding legally. That's a totally different argument. It's really a red herring. It's moving the goalpost, they would say. You're moving the goalpost to whether it's legally binding. But it is okay. So that's a moral question. And it's also a question of the laws, as far as will the law come and arrest us or Matt for taking me on as his property. No, the law will not come arrest Matt Dillahunty for doing that. You cannot call 911 and say Matt Dillahunty and Jill just made an agreement where Jill would be Matt's property for 4 years. And they're going to say they're going to come arrest you for filing a false report. So when is it ever okay to own another person? When they want to be owned. So it's important when you're dealing with the liberal to define your terms, because they will try to blur distinctions. They'll try to obfuscate or confuse words. They'll change definitions of words on the fly almost. They'll speak out of both sides of their being, right? Or both sides of their tongue, my grandmama would say. So when you're in a debate with, this is the first thing I do when I'm debating slavery. First, I define terms. I make the audience aware of the fact, because the liberal is not going to be, because he is denying the truth of God's word in their own unrighteousness, Romans chapter 1. So it's for the audience primarily, not necessarily for the skeptic that's seared, has a seared conscience, and perhaps feels guilty, the white liberal that is, for what his ancestors did to blacks in the antebellum South, and perhaps now he's trying to make this something that all cultures have done, including the Israelites. But nothing could be further from the truth that there was one civilization that did not engage in slavery. It was the Hebrew Israelites. There may be others, but the term here, aved, means three things, not one thing. The term means three different things, not one thing. Our word for slave only means one thing today, primarily speaking. It could mean a slave, and by slave, we mean a slave as we know it, as we would define a slave today. It could also mean a servant, as we would know a servant to mean someone who voluntarily takes the position of a slave or a servant. Or it could be a bond servant, someone who owed money. So the text uses one word, but based, and again, the context has to be able to tell you, or it should be able to tell you, it does in most instances in the scriptures, whether or not we're referring to the enslavement or someone who is voluntarily being a slave, and then someone who owes money and then is forced to pay it back. So what Matt Dillahunty will try to do is he'll try to blur these distinctions and suggest that anytime you see the word slave, it must mean number one, it must mean someone who's being forced against your will, without proving that distinction. Listen to this. This is more from Matt Dillahunty. He's going to do more of what he does, which is lie on the Bible.
In Leviticus, we begin to see the difference between hired servants and slaves. And if one of your brethren who dwells with you becomes poor and sells himself to you, you shall not compel him to serve as a slave. As a hired servant and a sojourner, he shall be with you and shall serve you until the year of Jubilee. And then he shall depart from you, he and his children with him, and shall return to his own family. He shall return to the possession of his fathers. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over them with rigor, but you shall fear your God. Now, that's verses 39 through 43 there that talks about, hey, indentured servitude. You don't get to enslave your fellow Israelites.
Okay. Did you see that? Sleight of mind trick. Where in the text did it mention anything about enslaving anyone? It didn't. The text did not mention the enslavement of any person. Yet he adds that to the text. So it's very important, and we'll go back to that clip again and play some more of it. But it's very important that you define terms with the atheists, because they will try to take the term slave and turn it into enslavement. I made that mistake in my graduate studies. I had a professor who of humanities. Humanities is just the study of human civilization, human culture, et cetera, et cetera. And I was pleased to see that a humanities teacher actually began her humanities course in Egypt rather than in Europe or Rome and Greece. So that was sort of refreshing. But I made that same mistake when I said that the Africans who were brought here were slaves. She says, no, that is incorrect. They were not slaves. They were enslaved. They were enslaved. Okay, they were forced to work against their will. They were forced to move from one location to the other. That's what the Bible calls kidnapping. That's what we call kidnapping today. Okay, which was forbidden. You were put to death if you were found doing something like that. Okay, or what we call slave trafficking. Okay, that's forcing someone to move, to work and then move, to move and then work. You're forcing someone against their will to do something that they didn't have no that they had no intentions on doing. That's enslavement. Slave, as opposed to slavery, which, as I explained, has different connotations, different meanings, different usages. Okay, so the word slave here, or voluntary, um, proceeding from the will or from one's own choice or consent. So when we say voluntary, we mean that it is one's own consent, that no one is forcing them to do it. Okay, it's self-determining, it's intentional, it's regulated by the will. That's what voluntary means. Okay, and of course, involuntary would be the opposite. So again, what the skeptic has to prove, going back to my biblical challenge, is that these individuals, other than in the cases of war, POWs, captors, prisoners of war, whatever, and debt, they have to prove that these individuals were involuntarily there against their will. Okay, so just looking for the word slavery is not going to win this debate. You're going to have to do better than just looking for the word slavery, which is defined by Webster's Revised Unabridged Dictionary, and I would use this definition whenever you're dealing with a skeptic, because they love to obfuscate, they love to uh, change definitions, use definitions that are not really legal definitions of slavery. Matt Dillahunty will do that. Owning a person is not the legal definition of slavery. I'm going to show you that. So you can't come up to someone and say, well, you own that person, that means they're a slave. No, no, it doesn't work like that. Did the person want to be owned, first and foremost? That's the distinction you need to emphasize. That's the detail you need to emphasize. That's the distinction between, or that's what distinguishes a slave, as we understand one to be, and a hired worker or a voluntary worker. The condition, Webster's Revised Unabridged Dictionary, the condition of a slave, the state, this is the definition of slavery, the state of entire subjection of one's person to the will of another. So, in order to be a slave, or in order to prove slavery in the Bible, you have to prove that they're being subjected, that they're being or their will is being subjected to another person. It's also a condition of subjection or submission characterized by not their choice, but it's characterized by the lack of freedom, the lack of choice, the lack of the will. That's what you need to find in scripture, other than in the cases of war, other than in the cases of prison. Sure, prisoners should have no freedom of will. They should have no freedom of action. They should have no freedom to move about, right? So you can't look in scriptures and find places where a criminal is subjected or uh, submitted to this condition of a slave. That won't work. That's called being disingenuous, dishonest, and perhaps even borderline xenophobic or racist or bigoted. Because if we have laws in which we subjugate human beings today for committing crimes, then why couldn't the Hebrew Israelites? Why, if the Hebrew Israelites do that, they're considered to be slave masters because they use the word slave to describe them? Huh? Oh, uh-oh. Starting to all make sense now. Matt Dillahunty adds the word enslaved. I'm going to play this again, and this time I'm going to stop it and show you the uh, how to deal with this creep, this liar, Matt Dillahunty, lying on the Bible, lying for Satan, right? When you have skeptics who are adding words to the Bible, who are adding concepts that are not there. Again, that's called eisegesis. You're isolating a passage apart from its context, and a text without a context becomes a pretext, you've often heard, for whatever you want the Bible to say.
In Leviticus, we begin to see the difference between hired servants and slaves. And if one of your brethren who dwells with you becomes poor and sells.
All right, so is there a difference between hired servants and slaves in the Bible? Yes. They're just like there's a difference between work visas and full-time employees. There are privileges to being a citizen, just like there were privileges to being a citizen of Israel. Again, are you basing your judgment of how the ancient Hebrews conducted their culture based on our culture, or are you just making up your own criteria, one that is not consistent with the land that you live in? That's my question for Dr. Josh. What are you basing your judgment of the ancient Hebrews on? You can't be basing it on our culture, because in our culture we have rules that are different for citizens than that are for non-citizens. So yes, the rules for an event, if you were an Israelite, whether you were a proselyte or converted to the Israel or the Yahweh cult, we could say, the people of God, if you converted, didn't matter if you were a foreigner, you now inherited all of the privileges that you would inherit for, or that a natural born citizen would have already. So yes, a natural born citizen, they were not to be treated with rigor. And we're going to look into what exactly that meant. They were not to work simply, they were not to work certain types of jobs. They wash dishes instead of, the harder labor. But again, albeit none of the participants in this system are there against their will. Matt Dillahunty added that to the text. Sleight of mind trick. Whether or not they were a non citizen working with rigor or a citizen working without rigor, everyone is there voluntarily. Just like when someone comes over here and they work on a work visa, that's not considered slavery because they have to work on a work visa for 7 years or so until they get their citizenship. That's not slavery. That's a way of promoting Citizenship. Genius. Oh my goodness.
himself to you, you shall not compel him to serve as a slave. As a hired servant and a sojourner, he shall be with you and shall serve you until the year of Jubilee.
Anything here about the slave being forced? Anything here about the sojourner being forced? Anything here about the sojourner coming over on a ship tied in chains, bound in chains? Nothing. Nothing here about gangs of taskmasters from Israel, like the Midianites would do, going to other nations and gathering up people, stealing children from schools like Boko Haram. Any mention of that? And forcing them into slavery. Any mention of that? No. No mention of how the slave became a slave. But he wants to play on the word. He wants to play the emasculated beta male will fall for this because they haven't been taught how to think with logic and reason instead of emotion. And most women might think fall for this as well because they haven't been taught. So he's playing on your emotions that when you hear the word slave, you're going to automatically default to enslavement without proving enslavement. Sleight of mind tricks. That's all the atheist argument is nowadays. In the age of scientific enlightenment, in the age of information, sleight of mind tricks is all they have left.
And then he shall depart from you, he and his children with him, and shall return to his own family. He shall return to the possession of his fathers. For they are my servants, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. You shall not rule over them with rigor, but you shall fear your God. Now, that's verses 39 through 43 there that talks about, hey, indentured servitude. You don't get to enslave your fellow Israelites.
All right, there we go. Did the text say anything about being enslaved? So what is he doing? He's conflating the enslavement, the involuntary act of forcing someone to work against their will. He's inflating that, or he's pushing that onto the text. He's inserting that into the text to make it seem as though that rigor equals enslavement, right? So you may not have caught it because you may not be paying attention. You may not even care. But he just redefined rigor to mean enslavement. Sleight of mind. You got to pay attention to what people are doing when they're speaking about the Bible. You have to be cognizant of what they're doing and how they're doing it. He just redefined rigor. He says you may treat them with rigor, but for the other ones, the Israelites, you may not treat them with rigor. Therefore, it was okay to enslave them. No, doesn't follow. It's a non sequitur. It was never okay to enslave anyone, whether or not you treated them with rigor or you didn't treat them with rigor. First and foremost, we'll get to the rigor and what that actually meant. Again, it just simply meant that, like in ancient Greece, for example, there was domestic, and then there was agriculture slaves. So there were different classes of slaves. So in just like in the ancient Near East and in ancient Greece, there were different classifications of slaves. And if you were an Israelite, you were on a higher class. You were a citizen. So you were not required to do some of the tougher labor. That's all that meant. It didn't mean that you could enslave them. All right. The Greeks did the same thing. They had different classes of slaves because Greeks did not like to work for other people. In Israel, you were the head and not the tail. You did not work for other people unless you were poor. and then you would be hired by your fellow Israelite till you got back on your feet, and then you were able to own your own land and hire your own slaves from foreign lands, right? But unless you became an Israelite, whether again it be by conversion or what they call a proselyte, you would be a second class citizen. You would be like someone coming over here on a visa. You were not awarded all of the privileges of being a citizen. That's how you promote your country and citizenship and the assimilation of others. And that's how you grow and became prosperous. That's how America does it today. And that's how the Israelites did it then. So it's a bit bigoted to suggest that the Hebrew Israelites should not have had laws promoting citizenship when we have laws promoting citizenship today. We treat people differently depending on their citizenship status. You haven't proven enslavement. You inserted that into the text when you saw the word rigor. Rigor does not mean enslavement. They're two different words. Let's look at the word enslavement in a bit, but I'm gonna play a little bit more of this and see what else he has to say. Mr. Matt Dungahunty, Dung Cupcake of the Week Award goes to Matt Dillahunty.
But
Matt
beginning in verse
Dungahunty.
44, the very next verse, and as for your male and female slaves, whom you may have from the nations that are around you. So we've got this passage. We're reading, this entire passage, not just a single verse, and we're clearly making a distinction between Hebrew servants who are not slaves and slaves.
And is that distinction, Matt Dillahunty, on the basis of whether they're forced to be there or not? That's what you need to prove. You can't pull out of context the non-visa status and the status of a full-time employee with benefits and suggest that one is being forced to be there and the other isn't. You see how dishonest that is? Different classes of slavery or different classes of workers does not denote that any one of those two classes, especially the lower class, is forced to be there against their will. Non-visa status or visa status, temporary visa, um, you have different statuses of the immigrant when they come to this country, and they have to meet certain criteria, and after a few years their visa expires, they have to go back to their country, their work visa, or if they do certain things, they can stay in America. You can't use that as proof that America condones slavery, because there's a difference in classes of workers. That because there's a benefit to being a citizen. You can vote. You can't vote if you're not a citizen. Well, the Democrats are trying to change that, aren't they? All right. But you have privileges that are given to you, awarded to you for being a citizen. Why couldn't Israel do the same? Because these racist, bigoted, xenophobic idiots like Matt Dillahunty and Dr. Josh don't believe that the Hebrews should have been a sovereign state. And they believe the Hebrews are bloodthirsty, people who just made up stories about other countries so they can go in and invade them. Sort of how they believe, what they believe about America, right?
What's it say? As far as your male and female slaves, whom you may have from the nations that are around you, from them you may buy male and female slaves. Moreover,
From them you may buy male and female slaves. Where did it say that you can force them to be your male and female slaves? If you remember my old channel, formerly known as Jill, I had a conversation with Chris May, who was an atheist. He never came back, like I expected. Once they go black on Jill's channel, they never come back. Once the atheist comes here, they never come back. Okay, because I refute their argument soundly to the point where they don't have anything left. They can go on another channel and repeat that defeated argument if they choose. That's fine, but they'll never come back here. When you have answers, when you can answer these skeptical, made up so-called discrepancies in the Bible, etc., they don't want to have anything to do with you. They would rather buster their beliefs about the Bible or support their beliefs about the Bible and give confidence in them by going to other channels where the Christian perhaps is not able to answer. Did you understand how he arrived at the enslavement? He didn't arrive from it from the text. He arrived to it by reinterpreting the text, by suggesting because one group is treated differently, that group that's treated differently must have been enslaved. Sleight of mind trick, saints. Sleight of mind trick. Don't fall for the ruse, saints.
You may buy the children of the strangers who dwell among you.
Yeah, sure, you may buy the children. Now, they'll argue that the children don't have a choice. Well, who said they didn't? If the child said, now, ultimately, the parent has full autonomy over the child, and unless you were harming the child, even in the ancient Near East, as far as the Mosaic law, I can't speak for the law code of Hammurabi, but you had children have no autonomy or rights over their parents. If your parent says you're going to work, you're going to work against your will. Happened to me, happened to most kids in the hood. Okay, if they had a father in the home, you went to work with dad. You didn't have a choice. Did my dad make me a slave? All right, so they'll try to argue that, and that's pretty much what they've been dwindled down to, if you will, arguing that a child has rights over his parents not to work, which is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. So, yeah, if the parents gave you permission to purchase their child, whether it be if they dedicated their child to the temple for work, or if they dedicated their child for money to work for someone else or another house or another tent, wash the dishes, clean, vacuum, etc., and bring back a little change back to the house. Mama there waiting, when you get home. Where's that check at? Give me that check. I remember when I went out and I had my first paper route that I did, and I got $5, and Mama was waiting for that $5. I said, man, I was gonna go buy me some hot fries, and okay. All right, so it's all about whether or not the person wants to be there, but now you want to bring children into the situation to suggest that children have rights over their parents. No, they don't. Children do not have rights over their parents, even today in America. Now, Canada and liberals in Canada are trying to change that, where a child can wake up and say, you know what? Screw you, parents. I'm getting the sex change. 6 years old. I'm getting the sex change. And the state will come, the almighty state will come and grab the child up and say, hey, this is what he wants. Sorry, parents. God forbid that ever happens, that takes place here. But if we keep voting for these idiots and on Capitol Hill calling themselves Democrats, then we might wind up there. But right now, children do not have autonomy over their parents. Parents have full control unless they are harming. So bringing up children is not going to work either, Dr. Josh. Try again. But ultimately, it is the parent who's still making the voluntary decision to have their children work, not only for themselves, but for their children. Parents make decisions for their children still today.
And their families who are with you, which they beget in your land, and they shall become your property.
They're their property. They're there by choice. You still haven't proven they're not there by choice. All you did was take the word rigor and try to redefine it into no choice or enslavement. You haven't proven anything, Matt. It's no wonder you blocked me from your channel, from your show,
And you may take them as
your show and your
an
channel.
inheritance for your children after you, to inherit them as a possession. They shall be your permanent slaves. But regarding your brethren, the children of Israel, you shall not rule over one another with rigor.
Okay. So there you go. You shall not rule over them with rigor. And he's going to conclude, I guess, that the rigor there must mean that that person is being forced to be there and treated with rigor. If you were traveling from another country and you did not want to assimilate, your work, you had a different status as far as your classification of the ved would be. There were some that didn't want to live with their masters as workers or managers of shops or factories or, you know, not factories in the same sense that we have, but they would have trading sh- uh, ports or ships and so on. Uh, that was your choice, but you could be subject to what's called agricultural slavery, which is more of a harsher type of environment than someone working in a house or like a house slave or a house worker. So there were peasants, there were migrants who would seek out the large landowners, and they would come to these lands, and they would be hired workers. There's no one being forced here. That was a rigorous task. That was rigor. You were not to hire an Israelite, basically, to do that type of work. The level of an agricultural slave was not the same as that of a domestic slave. So that's what it means when it says that Hebrews, you're not to make them into or treat them with rigor. It doesn't mean that you could force anyone. They haven't proven that. It doesn't mean that you can force either to be there, whether it be in the house doing some of the minimal tasks or whether it be in the field doing some of the harder tasks. The liberal needs to demonstrate what they're saying to be true. Let me show you what they do with this word slave or enslaved. Let me show you a definition. Now, this definition here is taken from the a resolution, if you will, from the Geneva Convention. This is back in 1956. We know about the Geneva Convention. It basically gave rules of engagement when you were at war. So you could not just enslave anyone. Um, it had to be in the context of war. In war, you could take someone captive. Okay. Article 6 says the act of enslavement. This is what Matt wants to force onto the Bible, and again, in cases other than war, in prisoners, where it is okay to enslave, according to Geneva. He wants to force that into, or force a context in which Israelites were allowed to do this to anyone and even capture, I guess, they would have to capture these non citizens and bring them to Israel instead of them coming freely, as Leviticus 25 suggests. The act of enslaving one another person, means that you're making them a slave. The practice of enslaving prisoners of war eventually died out. That's not exactly true, but that's just the example they give in the sentence. Make someone a slave, cause someone to lose their freedom of choice or action. Okay. Article 7 says that slavery is defined as ownership or the right where the right of ownership is attached and exercised. So you need both, Matt Dillahunty. According to Geneva, Articles 6 and 7, you need both definitions to prove slavery, not just one. Slavery means, as defined by the Slavery Convention of 1926, the status or condition of a person over whom any or all the power is attaching to the right of ownership or exercise. Okay, the ownership of someone is being exercised. That's not the end all to be all with slavery. You have to also have Article 6 where you're enslaving them, meaning the right to ownership is not a right they gave you, it's a right you took from them and forced it onto them. Okay, slave trade means and includes all acts involved in the capture, acquisition, or disposal of a person. So, just like the Bible says or said thousands of years before Geneva, if you kidnap someone and you force them to be there against their will, that is what we call the enslavement of another human being made in the image of God. That was punishable by death. It has to involve not capturing, which denotes forcing. It has to involve the enslavement and then ownership of, not just ownership. So Matt Dillahunty, when he tries to pull that canard, when is it okay to own another person? That's your answer. You need both. You need that ownership to be ownership that is forced onto that individual, not just simply the fact that they own that individual, own that other person. Eleazar, for example, was owned by Abraham in the scriptures. We can point to several cases in scripture in which someone was in the vet and they wanted to be there. You can't find me one passage in scripture where someone was in the vet and they did not want to be there. And the Bible says that this is okay. Whenever that happened, the Bible calls it a great evil. Genesis chapter 50. When Joseph was sold into slavery against his will, it was considered a great evil. In fact, the brothers knew that they had done a great evil because when they encountered Joseph after he had risen to pretty much second rank in Egypt, they were terrified because they knew what they did was illegal, was wrong. You cannot enslave anyone in scripture. That is never sanctioned. The word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision, saying, do not fear, Abram, do not fear. I am a shield to you. I will protect you. Your reward shall be great. Abram said, O Lord, what will you give me since I am childless? So Abram, or later became Abraham, did not have children at this point in time in the story. Genesis chapter 15, I'm reading. I am childless, and the heir of my house or estate, not just one house, but he was a very wealthy man, his estate is Eleazar of Damascus. Eleazar was his slave that he owned. Do you think Eleazar wanted to be there? Or do you think Eleazar was kidnapped and forced to be there? And forced to be Abram's heir eventually. Bum, 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 bum. So the Bible has no problem with you owning another person. What he does have problems with is when that ownership is forced on that person. So if Abram did not have Isaac, Eleazar, his slave, would have taken control of his estate. Where do you see that in the antebellum South? Where do you see that in any ancient context? You don't. So you have given me no offspring. So the one born in my house, which was Eleazar, so Eleazar was one of those slaves who was purchased and who was born in the same or under the same household or in the estate of, meaning Abram owned him. He was born there. He was born a slave of Abram because his parents had lived perhaps and worked for Abram, and he was born in the household of Abram. Abram was head of the household. They really had head of household back then. You were head of your estate. You were head of your land, and people who lived with you were under you. You were the master of your estate. So, you think Eleazar wanted to be around? You think he wanted to stick around, or you think he wanted to leave? That's some slave. Sex without consent in the Bible? What? According to Dr. Josh, it looks like that may have been the case. Sex without consent in the Bible? I guess.
Let me answer the question by taking it to something else. So in Deuteronomy 22, a rapist is just to marry, has the option of marrying, depending on the circumstance, is going to marry the person that he raped, right? That's immoral, right? Deuteronomy 21 talks about a captive woman who is a slave, who is taken as a slave because she was beautiful, right? That's non-consensual. That's rape, right? By modern standards, by our terms, what we would say is rape.
Right.
Those two things are rape. Would they have said, if you went back in time and said, hey, is this thing that you're doing with this captive woman, is that immoral? They would say no.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer the question?
So if we were back then,
all right, that's rape. Deuteronomy 21 and 22, sex without consent. Yeah, sex without consent is rape, but is that what's going on in Deuteronomy 21 and 22? Well, let's look at those two passages here. Because again, the liberal scholar is not expecting you to think for yourself. He's only expecting you to be gaslighted by the words that he's using and not expecting you to think, go to the text, read the text yourself, study the text, exegete the text, and get an understanding on your own as to what the text is saying instead of relying on what Dr. Josh says the text is saying. So, sex without consent. Let's see if we can find that in Deuteronomy 21. All right, let's see if we can find that. And did he say Deuteronomy 21? Let me check again. Let me just double.
Let me answer the question by taking it to something else. So in Deuteronomy 22, a rapist is just to marry, has the option of marrying, depending on the circumstance, is going to marry the person that he raped, right? That's immoral, right? Deuteronomy 21 talks about a captive woman who is a slave, who is taken as a slave because she was beautiful, right? That's non-consensual. That's rape, right? By modern standards, by our terms, what we would say is rape.
Right.
Those two things are rape. Would they have said, if you went back?
All right, so he is certainly looking at Deuteronomy 21 and 22. So let's take a look at this and read this for ourselves and see if Dr. Josh is correct. Is there certainly rape going on here in the text? All right. The answer is no, as you can tell by the deflection in my voice. But let's read it for ourselves, shall we? And I'm going to start in verse 23. Suppose a man meets a young woman. Now, this is the New Living Translation, which is more of a contemporary translation, more of a dynamic translation, rather than a word for word translation. Um, and maybe I'll talk about that in another stream, but I don't have time today. Suppose a man meets a young woman, a virgin, who is engaged to be married, and he has sexual intercourse with her. If this happens within a town, you must take both of them, not just the man, but both of them to the gates and have them stoned to death. Now, was the woman caught in adultery? Did the Pharisees only bring her? Sure, but they weren't following this law. So you can't point to that. And I love when these sexist or these feminazi women point to that as, see, the Mosaic law was against women because they didn't bring the man, they only brought the woman. Well, that was their fault. The law clearly says here that you must bring both of them. So for whatever reason, they decided they were only going to bring the man caught in or the woman caught in adultery and not the man. That was their decision, not the law, not the Mosaic law. That was their fault, not fault in the Mosaic law. Let's continue. If this happens within a town, you must bring both of them to the gates, both of them, and stone them, both of them to death. The woman is guilty because she did not scream for help, which means it was consensual. She didn't say stop. That's consensual. The man must die because he violated another man's wife. So this is another man's wife that he violated, and this is how you are to purge evil from among you, whether it be evil from a woman or a man. But if the man meets the engaged woman out of the country and he rapes her, only the man must what? Die. The man must die. Do nothing to the woman because she had not anything here about the Bible condoning rape or sex without consent being sanctioned. Anything here so far? Am I reading the right verse, Dr. Josh? Am I in the right chapter? Since she is innocent, said the Bible says, she's not going to be killed. She's innocent. She's committed no crime worthy of death. Since the man raped her out of the country, it must be assured that she did try to scream for help, but there was no one to rescue her. So if she screams for help and or doesn't scream for help, it's because she wants to be there, right? Unless she's a mute or something, right? But like the idea was is that it was consensual. She didn't say no. She didn't say get off of me. She didn't scream. Then here she is in a place where no one can hear her, and it's then assumed that she did not want this to happen, but no one was close enough to hear her scream, so she's innocent. She's not going to be killed, unlike before. Suppose a man has intercourse with a young woman, verse 28, who is a virgin, but is not engaged to be married. If they are discovered, he must pay the father 50 pieces of silver. Okay, now the NIV says rape here. This is not the word rape here does not denote the same thing when we rape or when we use the word today. Okay, you're committing what's called a presentism fallacy to suggest that these words should denote or connote the same things or notions or ideas across millennia. 4,000 years, 5,000 years. That's just ridiculous. The NIV translate the word here into rape, but it more denotes a violation. So in ancient cultures and in Christian homes even today, we raise our daughters to believe that you are, even if you allow a man to have sex with you before you're married, if it's before marriage, it's a defilement. It's a disgusting thing. It is something that is vile. Not as vile as rape, but something that is very close to rape. In their understanding. In our understanding, the woman's virginity was considered to be something that was precious. And when you gave that up, when that was taken from you, it was considered almost like rape. So that's why the words here are very similar between rape and, but it's really talking about intercourse with an unmarried woman, okay, and a virgin. You were now responsible. So this isn't a someone being forced to marry their rapist. We already read what happened to the rapist. The rapist was killed in verse 27, verse 26. The rapist was put to death. This isn't referring a rapist. The author is not contradicting himself within the span of two sentences. Now all of a sudden the rapist has to pay a fee. But wait a minute, we just read where the rapist is dying. Only the man must die. So how right in the next very verse, see if you learn to read these things for yourself and start thinking for yourself, you won't fall for these tricks. How in the very next verse or two verses down, now all of a sudden we have rape being condoned and rape being just a fine? Hmm. So that should make you think and make you go into the text a little deeper and start looking in some of the lexicons and start looking at some of the more dynamic translations, which are not word for word because these words were like rape and intercourse before marriage were considered both to be a disgrace to the ancient Hebrews. That's just how much they cared about their women. Having sex with a woman before she was married and taking her virginity was considered to be disgracing her and her family and yourself and your family. See how they cared about women back then? Unlike us today. Whoa, good job, son. Another notch on your belt. What? Excuse me? He has no intentions of marrying this woman? And you're proud, dad, to say that your son at 16 had a girlfriend, had a girl. Oh, you didn't get her pregnant, did you? If so, we know we can take care of that. No, they respected women and children. The Mosaic law respects women and children, protects women and children. Suppose a man has intercourse with this young woman who is a virgin but is not engaged to be married. Anything about rape here? If they are discovered, he must pay the father 50 pieces of silver. So Dr. Josh knows this. He's supposed to be, well, he's not a biblical scholar, so maybe he doesn't know this. But if you do any research or any study, you'll quickly be able to debunk Dr. Josh, just like I did in a number of debates already. Then he must marry the young woman because he violated her. So you were responsible to marry the young woman because you have tainted her, you have taken her virginity. You were now responsible for her. You were responsible for her and her child until you died. That's just how much they cared about their women because it was understood that that woman would become destitute without her virginity. No man would want to marry her. They wouldn't want to take her hand in marriage. She would become a prostitute to support herself and her child. That's when they would force the man to say, look, she is your responsibility now. You took her virginity. How many social ills would we solve if we would have implemented this back in the 60s instead of free love? How many social ills would be solved today if we said to every single young man, You get that woman pregnant. You no, not get just getting her pregnant. We've sort of moved the criterion to marriage to getting pregnant, right? They call them shotgun weddings. No, no. What if we said if you take her virginity, you must marry her? Hmm. He and what? He may never divorce her. Never. If you take a woman's virginity, you may never divorce her. You can never leave her destitute to whereby she's tainted now. She's probably had a few kids now. You could never leave her. So let's listen to Dr. Josh's lie again. Dr. Josh is claiming that this passage is talking about rape. Where did you see? Did anyone see?
Let's
Yeah.
let me answer the question by taking
Yeah.
it to something else. So in Deuteronomy 22, a rapist is just to marry has the option of marrying, depending on the circumstance, is going to marry the person that he raped, right? That's immoral, right? Deuteronomy 21 talks about a captive woman who is a slave, who is taken as a slave because she was beautiful, right? That's non-consensual.
That's a lie. All right, so let's go to Deuteronomy 21, where it talks about marriage to captive women. I'm going to show you how much of a liar and a hypocrite Dr. Josh is, all in one session. Okay, um, does the Bible say that you can marry captive women? And if that is the case, is that rape? Okay, that's the question on the table. And I'm surprised these debaters, Stewart or whatever the other guy's name is, didn't catch on to this. But again, not everyone is equipped or able to deal with these arguments that are being put forth by the skeptic. They're really not arguments at all. They're really straw men. Okay. And it's gaslighting, it's dishonest, it's probably borderline racist. Okay, because and I gave you a few examples of how they don't do this with America. Actually, they do, they're liberals. But um, if you were to say to America that America is racist or is practicing slave rape or rape slavery, forced sex slavery, we can call it, because Vietnam, World War II veterans took war brides, they're called, home back to the States and married them, you're engaging now in a on very, you're treading now on very dangerous waters. Okay. Because that's exactly what happened in the ancient Near East. But when the Hebrews do it, it's sex slavery. When America does it, it's okay. It's rescuing these women from probably what's going to be a tough life now that the village they lived in was burnt down by napalm. It's rescuing them, it's showing mercy on them. And yes, some of the men in Vietnam, Japan, found the women to be attractive. Oh, wow. What a crime of against humanity. I vote for abortion every 4 years, but finding a woman that is a victim of war that was probably due to her government being aggressive or attacking a sovereign nation, into whereby we had to intervene. What a crime against humanity to marry her. What a crime. Ridiculous. Suppose you go to war. Now, again, the mere fact that this liberal so-called scholar, Dr. Josh, has to appeal to cases of war means that he already lost the debate. Because in cases of war, there are instances in which you have to enslave citizens and even war combatants, and you're doing so for their protection. because they don't know what war is going to break out in what area. So you can't just have them roaming around so that they can be ravaged by barbarians and wild animals while you fight a war. No, you were responsible if you're in that land, according to Geneva. You're responsible for those people. You are to capture them. The not the text, but the Geneva Convention states that you're to capture them, and then you are to treat them with any type of treatment they may need, medical aid, first aid, food, water, clothing, 3 meals a day, etc. You are to house them, and no, they can't leave. No, you cannot leave a camp. Well, I don't know if they'll chase you down. If you do leave, if one leaves, they might not chase you down, but they are responsible for you. If they don't give you at least the choice to be there. Now, if you're a prisoner of war, meaning you fought, you definitely can't leave. If you fought against the army of the United States or the Navy or the Marines or whatever, but if you are simply a captive, a woman and a child, where are you going anyway? Where you going? You just gonna start walking? I'm walking. Yes, indeed. I'm walking. Where you going? Your entire village was burnt down. But anyway, so they're just revealing their hypocrisy that it's okay for one nation to do it, the nation that they live in, but it's not okay for the Hebrew Israelites to do it. That's racist.
Racist! That's 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 racist!
That's racist. You can't suggest that one culture can do what it does to, in as far as war is concerned, that what they're doing is sex slavery in this instance. But when another culture does it, your own culture, European culture, it's not sex slavery. Suppose you go to war against your enemies and the Lord God hands them over to you and you take some of them captives. Nothing wrong with that. The rules of engagement are different in war, as I explained. And suppose you see among the captives a beautiful woman. What a crime. And you are attracted and you want to marry her. What a crime. What a crime against humanity. If this happens, you may take her to your home. Now, she is a war captive. She is being captured for her own benefit. She is not likely to survive out there in the wilderness where fights are breaking out, skirmishes are breaking out. She's not a trained soldier. She's not a survivalist. You are responsible for her, whether it be Vietnam, whether it be World War II, whether it be the Korean War, or whether it be the ancient Near East. You are responsible for those women and those children that you take captive. The Bible doesn't sugarcoat war. War is a reality. The Bible doesn't sugarcoat war. In fact, we get our Geneva Convention, our just war theories from the Bible. We don't get it from the Code of Hammurabi. We don't get it from ancient Greece and Rome and their war tactics and strategy. We get it from the Bible. If this happens, you may take her to your home and rape her. No, if this happens, you may take her to your home and marry her. She changed the clothes she was wearing when she was captured. She will stay in your home. Let her mourn for her mother and father, and for a full month. Her mother and father were probably killed in the battle. Then you may marry her. Oh my goodness, what a crime against the humanity. Then you may marry her and she will be your husband and she will be, or you will be her husband and she will be your wife.
Where are we at in society today? Come after me. I'm a man. I'm 40.
Come after me. I'm a man. I'm 40. So let's go back to Dr. Josh and see what he has to say next.
Deuteronomy 21 talks about a captive woman who is a slave, who is taken as a slave because she was beautiful, right? That's non-consensual. That's rape, right? By modern standards, by our terms, what we would say is rape.
Right.
Those two things are rape.
All right. By modern terms, is this rape? By modern terms, Dr. Josh? Is this rape by modern terms? I think you might want to apologize to every single man who fought for this country to protect your butt to get on the internet and say something so stupid. That should have been the dumb comment of the week, but I didn't make one. But that should have been the dumb comment of the week. Did these men here who fought for this country, did they rape these women and force them to have children? Is a little rape going on here, as Scholar Fiction would say? Didn't think so. Did these Japanese women or Korean women, were they raped? They look pretty happy to me. Well, one's not smiling, but she's probably still mourning the death of her mother and father, or her father, probably, most likely. There's some Viet Cong women who fought too. They were no joke. Okay, do they are they being raped here? Looks like they're getting ready for a marriage wedding. Okay, so in even in our own culture today, we have what's called war brides. You can Google this. Do yourself a favor, Google war brides, and click on the images and see all of the photos of the men and women who, the men being soldiers of our armed forces, marrying women from these countries, these war torn countries that they were overseas fighting against. You have war brides. The War Brides Act of 1945 dealt with that. Know your history when you're dealing with these people, because they're dealing with historical claims from the ancient Near Eastern Hebrews, but rarely do they compare them with the same historical facts of our history not too long ago. Google the War Brides Act of 1945. Google the unturned or untold stories of the Japanese war brides, the Korean war brides, uh, the war brides of Japan. That story's been told. World War One, World War Two. Do your research. Just don't let these idiots get on the YouTube and talk about the Bible in a way using standards that they don't apply equally in all war situations. As if the ancient Hebrew warfare and their art of war was any different from ours. Of course, the technology has improved the way we can conduct war and the efficiency um, of war. But go and Google GI war brides, the romances of World War II, and the GI brides. Go Google this stuff. It's right there on your internet, on your computer. You have your Bibles, atheists, read them. So why is it when the Hebrews do this, is it considered rape? Because we're dealing with 19th century liberal scholarship, which its only goal seems to be is to try to denigrate and to discredit the God of the Bible. So that's why you hear things like this, like what Dr. Josh is saying about the Hebrews, that they somehow engaged in some immoral act for marrying women who otherwise would have been left destitute and abandoned. So I'm just going to get back on my transport vehicle and go back to the United States after I just blew up the entire town and killed all the men. So no, the Bible says, look, if you see someone you're attracted to, you may marry her. It's not saying you have to marry all the women or any of the women, but it's saying, yes, you may marry her because the Bible, God, the God of the Bible, understands the fact that you just wiped out all the men, and now these women have to fend for themselves or be ravaged by barbarians that are roaming, looking for who and what they may pillage. It says, then you may marry her, and you will be her husband, and she will be your wife. By golly, what's wrong with that? Nothing. Well, the laws of Hammurabi, oh my goodness. Dr. Josh just didn't quit in this debate. I don't understand how these two, Stewart and the other guy, Mickey Mouse, I don't understand how they weren't able to deal with these claims. They just let this Dr. Josh spew out all of this rhetoric and not make him back up what he's saying. Make the atheists back up what they're saying. Don't let them gish gallop. As soon as they open up their mouth to make one claim, one positive claim, if they're even man enough to do so, usually they'll do so without realizing it, and they catch themselves from making a positive claim. They'll try to stop themselves from making one. That's how much of a coward that these individuals are. The emasculated, intellectually emasculated beta male liberal. They try so hard not to make positive claims, but they can't help themselves. Sometimes they slip out, and when they do, force them right then and there. Don't let them move on. Don't let them elaborate or try to back out of their claim by fiddlebustering. Right then and there, force them to prove it. Force them to prove it. Listen to this. How these two opponents, I don't even believe they're Christians. They might be atheists. Who knows? How they didn't catch this, I don't know. It's one of the oldest tricks in the book. The laws of Hammurabi, the code of Hammurabi were better than the Mosaic law. Okay. According to whose ethics and whose standards? Oh, that's another debate.
Commandments. Clearly, there is something that is going on with preservation, etc.
It's two things. One, the Israelites and the legal system that is seen in the Pentateuch is very similar to, almost indistinguishable from, in many ways, what you see in the ancient Near Eastern law codes. And in some places, for example, with slavery, something like the laws of Hammurabi are actually a little bit better, right, than what you see in the biblical text. So there's release after 3 years for a debt slave in the laws of Hammurabi, as opposed to 6 for the Israelite. But I mean, on par, you can read somebody like Raymond West.
Wow. So there was that. So, and every time you hear a skeptic say something so dumb, they always seem to cite the same argument. Let me let you hear this again, and we're going to take a closer look at this slide here. But they always use the same argument or the same example, that the 3 years versus the 6 years, right? That's their only example. The reason why they always use that same example is because that's their only example. Okay, let me let you hear it.
Clearly, there is something that is going on with preservation, etc.
It's two things. One, the Israelites and the legal system that is seen in the Pentateuch is very similar to, almost indistinguishable from, in many ways, what you see in the ancient Near Eastern law codes. In some places, for example, with slavery, something like the laws of Hammurabi are actually a little bit better, right, than what you see in the biblical text. So there's release after 3 years for a debt slave in the laws of Hammurabi, as opposed to 6 for the Israelite. But I mean, on par, you can read somebody like Raymond West.
All right, so that's his example, and that is probably the only example that they can find in the two law codes that they would consider to be better. Okay, 3 years versus 6. If something is better than something else, you better be able to show me more than just a 3-year difference in servitude. If you want to convince me that one is better than the other. If I said to you, you can work for me for 6 years, and after you can inherit my estate if I don't have any children, like Eleazar and Abraham, or you can work for me for 3 years and you won't inherit anything. You'll just go to someone else and begin and work for them. You won't inherit anything for your own estate. I'm taking the 6 years. So more years is not always better than less years. Okay. So, but let's look at the difference between the two codes here, if we can. The law of Hammurabi. If you could see this, I don't know. I can't blow this up any bigger, but so you just have to believe me on what it's saying here. Now, let's look at the topics. Now, there's the code, there's some other codes here. The code of Ur Namu, that which is more like the Babylonian type of thing. Um, and then there's some Haitian codes here, I think. All right, so we're only going to be concentrating on the Code of Hammurabi, which is this one, and then Old Testament, which is the last column, first column and the last column. All right, so if you were a runaway slave, now you only got 3 years, but guess what happens if you run away in those 3 years, Dr. Josh? If you were under the Code of Hammurabi, okay, if anyone takes a male or female slave off to the court or of the court, or a male or female slave of a freed man outside the city gates, he should be put to death. Okay. Verse 18. If the slave will not give the name of the master, the finder shall bring him to the palace. A further investigation must follow. So what's going on here? Just like the fugitive slave laws in the antebellum South, you were to bring this person, and they were supposed to, this person that ran away, and they were supposed to give the name of their master. For what reason? So that they can be returned to their master. Okay. So if you stole someone else's slave, you were put to death. And if that person, once you were found with that stolen slave, they would then interrogate the slave and say, who do you really belong to? That's what's going on here in verses 15 through 18. There's some context missing, of course. You can see the 3 verses are missing. But that's what's going on here. Now they put the person that kidnapped you to death. Now they're going to ask the slave, who's your master? Because we're going to take you back to him. If the slave will not give the master, the finder shall bring him to the palace. Further investigation must follow, and his slave shall be returned to his master. Okay, so if the slave runs away, if the slave is found to be with someone who didn't own him, that person would be put to death, and the slave would be forced to give up who he should be returned to. If he hold the slaves in his house and they are caught there, he shall be put to death. Okay, now let's look at what happens to runaway slaves now. If I run away under the Code of Hammurabi, An investigation must be done. I have to give up who my slave owner is, and I must be returned to him. Now, Old Testament, you shall not hand over his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. Well, what should you do with him? He shall live with you in your midst, in the place that he shall choose, in one of your towns, where it pleases him. You shall not mistreat him. Boy, I'm taking the 6 year deal. I'm taking the 6 year deal because if I want to leave, I can leave. And you can't investigate and follow me and bring me back to the person where I left. I chose to leave. If I choose to leave, I shouldn't be allowed or forced to go back to my master. I'm taking the Old Testament 6 year. I'm taking that deal. I don't know about you. All right, let's look at injury. Let's look at being a slave injury or being an injured slave. If he kills a man slave, he shall pay 1/3 of a mina. Got that? If you kill someone's slave, you were forced to pay a fine under the code of Hammurabi. So yeah, I got my 3 years, but if anyone kills me in that 3 years, Dr. Josh, guess what? The only thing that's gonna happen to the person that killed me is they have to pay a fine. If he put out the eye of a man's slave or break the bone of a man's slave, he shall pay 1/2 its value. So during that 3 years, Dr. Josh, that's so much better than the Hebrew slave of 6 years. So much better, right? If my eye gets put out and I'm walking around now with a patch looking like a pirate, the only thing that happens to my attacker is he's fined half of my value, not even my full value. I'm worth $1,000. If he puts my eye out, he's only fined. The person who did it is only fined 500. I'm taking that. I don't know about you guys, but hey, I'm taking that 6 year deal. Put me on that 6 year deal with the Old Testament law, please. Thank you. All right, let's look at what happens to a slave injury, or if a slave is injured in the Old Testament Mosaic law. And an owner who hits his male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must completely let the slave go free. So in one instance, I'm killed, nothing happens. I have the my abuser just pays a fine. Oh, well, I'll just go around beating up slaves. I got enough money to do that. I'll just go around beating up slaves and I'll just pay the fine. All right, but in the Old Testament, if you hit someone in the eye, you have to let them go because you're compensating for that eye. And the owner who knocks out a tooth of the slave must go to compensate for the tooth. Also, you were put to death in Exodus 21 if you harmed or if you killed a slave, you were put to death. Okay, you fell under the jurisprudence of someone who killed a citizen or someone who wasn't a slave. So the punishment was the same. If you killed a slave or if you killed a non-slave. Okay. Deuteronomy. Let's look at some passages of scripture I wanted to share with you. There was no difference between the stranger and the treatment thereof that of the Israelite slave. Okay, Leviticus 19 says that Israelites were commanded to love the stranger in the land. And when the stranger resides with you or in your land, you are to do him no wrong. You shall not do him wrong. We read Leviticus 23 or Deuteronomy 23 that the fugitive slave, could freely choose a place to live in Israel, in your midst, in one of the towns. So if someone were a fleeing slave, a runaway slave, they would be allowed to live in the midst of one of the towns in Israel. They were not captured, rounded up, and forced. There was no investigation done to find out where they were from so we can return them. They were allowed to live freely in the towns. So Israel was commanded to offer a safe harbor for runaway slaves, a safe place, if you will. Punishment for slaves, punishment on slaves. If a slave says to his master, "You are not my master," meaning he doesn't want to be the slave anymore under this person, if they convict him, his master shall cut off his ear. That's for insubordination. That's called insubordination. You were punished by way of your ear being cut off. Man, I'm taking the 6-year deal. I don't know about you guys. I'm signing the 6-year contract with the Old Testament law. Thank you. Idiot. 3 years or 6 years versus 3 years. As if that's the end to be all with being a vet or a worker or a slave. How long? Oh, you don't want to read the rest of these codes, these other two codes. Just it'll shock you as far as how they treated workers. In the Old Testament, there is no punishment on slaves. There's no prescribed or no punishment on slaves. So slaves fell under the same jurisprudence, the same rules that a non-slave would fall under the Mosaic law. Everyone fell under the Mosaic law. So Israel was commanded to harbor runaway foreign slaves. They were commanded to take care of foreign slaves, to allow them to live and move about freely. J.A. Moyer puts it like this in Exodus, message of Exodus. He says Hebrews have no vocabulary of slavery, only servanthood. Hebrews have no vocabulary of slavery, only servanthood. Shalom, brother Joe, or brother Veckel. I'm brother Joe. And Universal Artisan is in the room. A couple more people I want to give a shout out to. Mamba Snakes in the room. What's going on? What's the takeaway? What's the takeaway? Says Dr. Josh thinks rape. It is rape to allow women to be unfettered and irresponsible. Yeah. Yet somehow selective service is honorable and noble. Yeah. War brides, men and women who fought in this country, married women who were part of those cultures, who were left behind and destitute, and he doesn't call that rape. I bet you. I bet he doesn't consider that to be rape. But when the Hebrews do the same exact thing, Shalom Mindbreaker, they're considered to be rapists. Now, when Praise did his video calling Dr. Josh a bigot, at first I was sort of hesitant to, buy into such. Um, but then I started to research, and I started to realize that, hey, this is something that a bigot would say, because most bigots are hypocrites. So when they criticize someone else and they're doing the same things, it's probably because there's something about that other person they don't like. Now, you could suggest that Dr. Josh doesn't like the God of the Bible, not necessarily the Hebrews. When you criticize a culture for protecting its citizens, for protecting captives, and we're doing this by capturing them, protection through captivity, yes, and we do the same thing today, you're a racist. You're an anti-Semitic bigot. When you criticize the Hebrew culture for marrying women who are captives after a war or during warfare, and we have pictures and photos of World War II and Japanese soldiers or soldiers that fought in Japan and Korea, Germany, and we have pictures of war brides of young girls, Asian girls, smiling from ear to ear, taking pictures, getting married with flowers in their hair, and you don't call that rape, you could be considered a bigot for doing that. You could be considered anti Semitic for doing that. Yes. So praise was right on. Praise was right on with that. Shalom P Mars. P Mars is in the house leaving his commentary. And what's the takeaway? Yeah, he spams the N word everywhere. That's his. Jill is just a monkey. Yeah, well, that's what the atheists say. And Jamie Russell says God did it. Yeah. All right. So I want to show you this because Dr. Josh has been utterly defeated in finding gangs of taskmasters forcing people to work in the Bible. So he now has to appeal to warfare. So that seems to be the next line of argumentation. Since I can't find taskmasters, gangs of Israelite slave masters going around stealing people, kidnapping people that was punishable by death, so that couldn't have been the case. I'm now going to appeal to passages which speak about warfare. That's what he just did with Deuteronomy 22. Suppose a man, or Deuteronomy 21, okay, where it talks about going to war against your enemies, and you see a beautiful woman, you're attracted to her, you want to marry her, okay, or marriage to a captive woman. He calls that rape, but he doesn't call it rape when our soldiers do it. I hope not. So now their argument is defeated. So now they have to appeal to cases. If you go back to my challenge, cases in which we would enslave or force someone to live on a compound, perhaps today. POWs, war captives. So since they took it there, I went over to the League of Nations, I went over to the Treaty of Versailles, and I went over to the Geneva Convention because they took it there. They took it to warfare. They tried to argue that warfare is an example of slavery. They argue that. That's why I went to the Geneva Convention to show them that, hey, look, here's warfare in the 20th century, and they were doing the same things to survivors, to captives, that the Bible talks about them doing to their survivors or their captives or the Canaanites or the etc. So why is it that when the Hebrews do it, it's wrong, it's immoral, it's rape? When your white European ancestors did it, it's noble, it's pure. Yeah, so I can see the argument that Praise is making. I can see that argument. So let's take a look at this. This is just um, a graphic here talking about the provisions of the Versailles Treaty. Okay, the Versailles Treaty was one that was supposed to end uh, World War II, but World War One, excuse me. Uh, and it was done. It was a in 1919, I believe, in June, in at a palace of Versailles in Paris. So this took place in France, and it codified the peace terms between the Allied powers, which were United States, Great Britain, I believe, and I think France. Oh no, I'm getting my Allied powers wrong. I have to get a list of who was the Allied powers, but the Allied powers included the United States. We know that much. Um, Against the Hitler and the Nazi Party, or not Hitler, against World War I, not World War II, but against what they called themselves, I think, the Axis powers. Germany was responsible for the war, basically. Germany was part of the Axis powers, and they were considered responsible for starting the war because they were. So because they started the war, they were imposed very harsh penalties in terms of loss of territory. We see here massive reparations, 33 billion in reparations over 30 years, $33 billion. Since you want to bring up the Israelites and how they deal with countries that were doing what Germany did, starting wars, killing children systematically uh, through their sacrificing to Molech, and therefore God is the one that started the war. Truth be told, because of their war on children, women and children. So yeah, God was the one who declared war on these countries. So that's a context you can't leave out. Now, Dr. Josh will claim that that's not the case. In fact, here he is saying such. Dr. Josh will claim that the Hebrews just made all this stuff up just to have an excuse.
Commandments. Clearly, there is something that is going on with preservation, etc.
It's two things. One, the Israelites and the legal system that is seen in the Pentateuch is very similar to, almost indistinguishable from, in many ways, what you see in the ancient Near Eastern law codes. In some places, for example, with slavery, something like the laws of Hammurabi are actually a little bit better, right, than what you see in the biblical text. So there's release after 3 years for a dead
That's
slave
a lie.
In the laws of Hammurabi, as opposed to 6 for the Israelite. But I mean, on par, you can read somebody like Raymond West.
That was a lie. 3 years instead of 6. But we learned that there are other things involved than just the 3 years versus the 6 years, right?
Let me answer the question by taking it to something else. So in Deuteronomy 22, a rapist is just to marry has the option of marrying, depending on the circumstance, is going to marry the person that he raped, right? That's immoral, right? Deuteronomy 21 talks about a captive woman who is a slave, who is taken as a slave because she was beautiful, right? That's non-consensual. That's rape, right? By modern standards, by our terms, what we would say is rape.
Right.
Those two things are rape. Would they have said, if you went back in time and said, hey, is this thing that you're doing with this captive woman, is that immoral? They would say no.
Mm-hmm.
Does that answer the question?
Raise it! Just 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 raise it!
That's racist, Dr. Josh. All right, so that's why I found this little graphic here on the Versailles Treaty, because they'll also say, in addition to rape, because there were war brides, there must have been rape, therefore rape, war brides, therefore rape, and married, quote unquote, to the rapist, therefore rape. Even though we learned that that's not that wasn't the case, that this was just consensual intercourse with an unmarried woman who was a virgin, which in their eyes was very close to rape. So the words are very similar. They will also argue that and Dr. Josh argues later in this debate, or somewhere in this debate, that the conquest, the land conquest, was that of a uh, immoral, or that of a exploitative type of nature, that the Israelites were using the charges of baby sacrifice, homosexuality, bestiality, that this wasn't really going on in the ancient Near East. That, well, he may want to argue that it wasn't widespread, but it was certainly going on. So, therefore, the entire campaign was an unjust campaign. But of course, he's not going to provide any evidence that the Israelites just made it all up. That's just one of his assertions, because that's just what people did in the ancient Near East. They made up things in order to have an excuse to go to war. People still do that today, right? 9/11. They didn't make up 9/11, but you get the point. Um, Nero burnt down his own library and then blamed it on the Christians in order to go to war against the Christians, right? In order to have a reason or excuse to attack the Christians. So we see that going on in history, but does he have evidence that the Hebrews did this? No, he does not. All right. So, as far as we know, the countries, according to Scripture, not as far as we know, but according to Scripture, the countries that were engaging in these behaviors were guilty. So, therefore, they were removed by force. So, it was a just war. Dr. Josh and his liberal scholarship can suggest otherwise, but they can't prove otherwise. So, just like when Germany, who started the war, they were now responsible for reparations, so were the Jebusites, so were the Canaanites, and all of the ites that were fought against in the book of Moses, or the first 5 books of the Bible, Joshua. So, and those were the peace terms. The peace terms were between the victorious Allied powers and Germany. Okay, and then you have Woodrow Wilson's Peace Without Victory, where he outlines in his famous 14 points. Um, so the Treaty of Versailles humiliated Germany. This is the reason why many historians say Hitler was so upset, and why he did what he did in World War II, because of what the Versailles Treaty did to his country, therefore did to him. It turned Germany into second class citizens in their own country. It turned the German people, the government had been subverted. Economic distress, and this was a result of the treaty. It helped to fuel the nationalist settlement that led to the rise of Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party, as well as World War II, which came 2 decades later. So these were some of the provisions. Okay, and you can see here that what we have in Scripture, as far as how the foreign nations were treated after they were captured, it's very similar, if not better, because you became a citizen, you had the option to become a citizen of Israel, but you had to denounce your pagan baby sacrificing religion, and you would become a citizen of Israel, and you would fall into um, the same rules and laws that apply to an Israelite. Now, if you committed something like murder, that may not have been the case. I have to do my research on that, but there may have been some exceptions to you joining Israel. You know, so there was territorial losses. Same thing happened in the ancient Near East. Israel took their land from them. They didn't deserve it anymore. That was their punishment. That was their punishment. That was Germany's punishment for starting a war. It's called war. Again, the mere fact that I'm wasting 20 minutes talking about war and slavery means you've already lost the debate. Why couldn't you find territorial losses because of the person's skin color, or because of the person you didn't like the person, or because the person was a part of another tribe? Why couldn't you find anything in the Bible that suggests that you could be made a slave or enslaved for reasons outside of war? It's because you've already lost that debate. That's why. That's why when I asked you, Dr. Josh, find me a case other than in war where the enslavement of a human being was sanctioned, you didn't have an answer. You went straight to Deuteronomy 20, which talks about going to war. So Germany had to return some land that they stole. The French border was extended to the Rhine River. Germany had to also, of course, surrender all of their colonies that they plundered in Africa and the Pacific. There were military restrictions. Did the Israelites place military restrictions on the countries that they conquered? Yes. Are they somehow bloodthirsty, warmongering, uh, neocons for doing such? No. If that's the case, then you'd have to say the same thing about our country. Otherwise, you're a hypocrite. There were military restrictions. They limited the size of the government. Germany was not allowed to produce weapons to be used in warfare against anyone. They were forbidden to have submarines or an air force. We know about the German subs. They were very influential in these battles. They were responsible for the war, and they had to pay reparations. So when Israelite does that to a nation, even if it's the citizens that are being forced to work, that's not slavery. Hitler was forced to work for the Allied powers because of the Treaty of Versailles. Because of the treaty. So it is completely racist to suggest that Hebrew Israelites or the Hebrews could not have done the same at their battles or towards the end of their battles. They signed treaties as well. I think we have one more clip from Matt.
The Bible's position on usury isn't that it's a sin. Exodus 22 through 20 or 22 verse 25 says, "If you lend money to any of my people who are poor among you, you shall not be like a moneylender to him. You shall not charge him interest." But if that's not clear enough, we can go beyond Exodus into Deuteronomy chapter 23, beginning at verse 19. "You shall not charge interest to your brother, interest on money or food or anything that is lent out at interest. To a foreigner you may charge interest, but to your brother you shall not charge interest." Usury wasn't a sin. You just couldn't charge other Jews interest. You could charge foreigners interest all day long. If you can't read a single verse correctly, I'm not sure that it's likely that you're going to read the entire chapter correctly.
That's what I'm saying about you, Matt. If you can't read a single verse correctly, I'm not sure you're able to read any of the Bible correctly. And I've already shown you misreading the Bible on several occasions, one being adding the word enslaved or infusing the notion of enslavement onto a text where it's not there. That's you not reading the Bible correctly. I think he was referring to G-Man there in that video, but he just showed how much of a hypocrite he really is. Okay, so usury. This goes back to what I was saying earlier about charging interest. Is it a crime against humanity to have sets of rules for one group of people that are citizens, that are contributing, that are paying taxes, and therefore contributing to the society that they live in? Is it a crime against humanity to say that someone who comes over here illegally does not have those rights, or even legally? Is it a crime? No, because that's exactly what happens in America. In America, although it has nothing to do with interest, in America there are certain privileges you have for being a citizen. One is that I get to work a full-time job with benefits, not a visa. I have a social security number and I can receive benefits. I can vote. I don't have to work on a temporary visa. I don't have to file any immigration status, or when I'm filling out an application, I don't have to make display or talk about an immigration status and fill out paperwork. I don't have to do those things, right? Because I'm a citizen. There is an advantage to being a citizen. So again, why is it when the Israelites place advantages, privileges on being a citizen in this case, as far as charging interest, you are not to charge your fellow Israelites interest, but you could charge a foreigner interest. Whoop-de-doo. Whoop-de-doo. What a crime against humanity. What a crime. Yes, there are different laws, different rules that allows an alien to reside and work permanently in the US. They're called green card holders. I don't need a green card. Does that prove that the green card holders are slaves? No. Although the card has not always been green. But to be eligible for permanent resident status, the foreigner must indicate their intention to live permanently in the US. So you can't just come here, make a bunch of money, and take it over back to your country and contribute to that society. I don't have to make that intention. I'm a citizen. So, yes, there are family based visas, there are visas for spouses. I don't have to follow those laws or rules. Those rules don't apply to me because I'm a citizen. There's conditional permanent residency. There's special immigrant juvenile status. There's, I mean, there's asylum type of laws or conditions for refugee or asylum status. Please stop with the tired arguments. They don't work. At least not in here. There's a reason why he doesn't allow me on this channel, because I will destroy him. There's a reason why he doesn't debate, because he'll be demolished succinctly and with the facts. His argument would crumble and would be crushed, rather, in light of the facts, under the facts. So the fact of the matter is that the Bible does not promote slavery. I like the word. Now this is Hank Hanegraaff, but I like, rather than promote, I would rather say it doesn't sanction slavery. Doesn't promote or sanction. Same thing. You're really saying the same thing. It's not promoting it as something that is virtuous, that's something that is even necessary, as something that is good. It calls it an evil. The Bible denounces slavery as sin. The New Testament goes so far as to put slave traders, slave traffickers, in the same category as murderers, adulterers, perverts. That word there is homosexual, but I guess Hank didn't feel the need to include that. But that's what the word is in the Greek. The word there is not pervert, but homosexual. So God puts slave traders on par with homosexuals. There you go. And liars. Okay, First Timothy chapter 1, verse 10. Slavery within the Old Testament context was sanctioned due to economic reasons, economic realities. People were poor. This is how the poor was taken care of. This is how God dealt with poverty. He dealt with poverty by providing a way in which everything would be centered around work and servitude. And that's how the poor were dealt with, were taken care of. So Israel's laws regarding, as Paul Capon writes, these servitudes or these systems of servitude reflected a greater moral sensitivity than ancient Near Eastern counterparts, despite Dr. Josh's nonsense. And we can demonstrate that. They were more sensitive to the vulnerability of these workers, meaning because they were in a situation of destitute and they were desperate, that's usually the person who is taking these people in, or not usually, but in often cases, they will abuse those individuals. There was a rash of, and there still is today, of Asian attacks in when I grew up in Queens. Flushing, Queens is pretty much like Chinatown in your city, but much larger. So it's mostly an Asian community. And the reason why they were a target by blacks, um, they were actually traveling to Flushing to rob and to pillage and to steal from these people. The reason why they were more of a target is because that many of them were illegal immigrants, and they were less likely to go tell the police that they were just robbed. So these people that were coming over here and they have this immigration status, some of them don't, some of them snuck over here. They're more of a target. They're more vulnerable. So God, in his infinite wisdom, says that we're going to make laws that reflect a greater moral sensitivity to this situation, meaning laws that are going to protect these individuals more so than the ancient Near East counterparts. That's according to scholars like Paul Capon. In Israel, the indentured servants were to be treated as human beings, not as things, as they were protected from inhuman abuse. That's according to Walter Eckrop, Theology of the Old Testament. There's your citation. An abused servant would go free. We read that earlier in Old Testament law. So a servant was certainly protected by the law, as opposed to the Code of Hammurabi, which only allows you, yes, 3 years, but along with those 3 years comes no protection under the law. Slavery within the Old Testament context was sanctioned due to economic realities rather than racial or sexual prejudices. Because bankruptcy laws did not exist, people would voluntarily sell themselves into servitude or slavery. A craftsman could thus use his skills to discharge a debt. Even a convicted thief, what we used to call community service, what actually we still call community service. If you rob or steal or you commit a crime, as long as it's not something like a felony, you wouldn't get jail time. You would have to serve your community service, in order to pay restitution for what you've done. Then you would be forced. You would not have an option. You don't have an option to do community service. Your only other option is jail. So, so yes, we do force people to make restitution. Are the Hebrew Israelites somehow culpable for doing the same in their society? This is why you were called an anti-Semitic bigot, Dr. Josh. It's because we're doing the same thing in our society. You don't say that it's immoral, but when darker skinned people do it, it is immoral. That's why you were called an anti-Semitic bigot. Although there were other reasons why you could have come to such conclusion. Maybe you just hate the Bible. Maybe you just hate the God of the Bible. Maybe it has nothing to do with the Jews or their culture. The liberating biblical truth is that all people are created by God with innate equality. Genesis chapter 1, Acts chapter 17, Galatians chapter 3, verse 28. There is neither Jew nor Greek, there's neither slave nor free, there's neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. I'll see you next time. Jesus is Lord and he's coming back. Stop watching fake news, liberal. That includes Dr. Josh.
If you reject Christ, then the moment you take your first step through the gates of hell, the only thing you will hear is all of creation standing to its feet and applauding and praising God because God has rid the earth of you.
I take full responsibility for my going to hell